I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we talk about the latest updates from the front lines, analyse the Ukrainian counterattack near Kharkiv, and discuss the latest on the diplomatic front as Finland and Sweden edge closer to NATO membership.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 16th of May, day 82. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor Nicholls and Mutaz Ahmed from our comment team. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from Ukraine.
Hi David, hi everybody. The big news over the weekend was not necessarily from the front line. It was that Finland has finally said it will apply for NATO membership. Sweden making very, very similar noises, yet to totally confirm, but Sweden expected to follow in due course. We will be talking about that a little bit later, I have no doubt. But over the weekend, so we have Belarusian forces are continuing their series of exercises. They're on the border with Ukraine. They've pushed, as well as the exercises there, they pushed air defence, artillery and missile units into training areas to the west of the country. The Defence Intelligence estimate from Britain's MOD says that this is just a continuation of those Belarusian exercises, but it will fix Ukrainian troops in the area of just north of Kyiv and north of the country, just in case the exercise turns into anything else or acts as a launch pad for any other Russian action there. It's assessed that this is likely, or President Lukashenko of Belarus he's got a delicate balancing act here. He's got to show a little bit of support for the Russian invasion, but not too much. He wants to avoid direct military participation. That would bring on Western sanctions. He also doesn't want to invite any Ukrainian retaliation, and he doesn't want to sort of start any dissatisfaction in the Belarusian military. So exercises as expected, but with a lot more, a few nuances in there. Also over the weekend, MOD Defence Intelligence say that Russia's forces in Ukraine have lost a third of the troops and equipment that they went into Ukraine with on February the 24th. That's up from 25% last month. So, I mean, these are really significant numbers. You are close to, in a normal setting, a force would culminate at this point, i.e. be no longer able to conduct offensive operations. I mean, these are just huge numbers. We have seen that in some areas. So the pressure, those local counterattacks to the north and northeast of Kharkiv that Ukrainian forces are able to knit together have turned into a larger operational push. There are images on social media of Ukrainian troops up to and on the border with Russia. They took their own border post. They were pushing this massive wooden post into the soil to mark the border with Russia. So to have Ukrainian troops up to the border with Russia is quite startling, to be honest. They've now got a choice to make because they're able to affect Russian resupply down through Belgorod, so about 30-40 k's north in Russia proper. But if they start shelling that, for example, then they would invite... firstly, it would validate Putin's reason for going into Ukraine. He would say that there is an external threat if they're now shelling Belgorod. There would undoubtedly be civilian casualties, which would undermine President Zelensky's position and could see a few fractures in the Western alliance. So unlikely Ukrainian troops, regular troops, will go any further over the Russian border, but it does mean that they can now push east. I imagine they would need some period of reconstitution, certainly rest, but they could push east to degrade those supply lines coming down south through Russia. And I'll just take a pause there.
Thanks, Dom. Mutaz, do you have anything to add on that?
I think Dom's covered most of it, but just to hammer home the point, I think the theme over the weekend has been of Russian failure, militarily, diplomatically, geostrategically. Right, they're failing on all fronts. Militarily, 1/3 of their troops lost, troops that they they positioned lost. Diplomatically, increasingly they're losing the likes of Israel, which was seen as an important middle power in this, and geostrategically, as Dom mentioned, Finland and Sweden joining NATO was something that was unthinkable even a year ago, even 6 months ago, and it's now very close to fruition. So these are astonishing developments.
Thank you very much, Mutaz. Dom Nicholls, there was an interesting thing in the Telegraph today about how the Ukrainians intentionally flooded a small village north of Kyiv, which people believe prevented an attack on the capital. Can you tell us about this? What happened? Why did they do it? And what was the impact?
This is the village of Demidov. It's to the north of Kyiv on the Irpin River, and the suggestion was that the Ukrainians took the strategic decision very, very early in the war. In fact, probably they took the decision probably before Russia had actually crossed the border, that this is what they would do. So Kyiv is a very short distance from the Russian border and the Belarusian border down to Kyiv, so that's always going to be a very vulnerable flank. So working with the weather at the time, in order to force Russia onto the paved surfaces, which not only channels their forces, but also you clearly know where they are, they took the decision to flood the area around the Demidov village. Now, this did result in significant disruption to the local civilian population. It not only meant that they couldn't work the countryside, but also it flooded homes and basements. So there was an effect there on their own people. However, villagers in Demidov, as we say today in the report in the paper and online, they said it was a sacrifice worth making. This did, as we saw, contribute to Russia having to channel their forces down very obvious routes. We saw that 40-mile-long convoy north of Kyiv sat there for days, slowly being attacked and nibbled away by Ukrainian anti-tank teams. So this was a significant undertaking and a significant decision, but it looks as if it did work, and it contributed in no small part to the defence of Kyiv.
Thanks, Dom. And there's also incredibly harrowing news that we've discovered. Well, this claims that 650 more victims have been executed by Russian soldiers in the Bucha region. This is a local official telling the BBC. Can we talk about that? What more has been discovered?
I mean, it's a horrible story. In terms of what more has been discovered, I'm afraid it's just numbers. We knew from the early days of when Russia pulled out from Bucha being the northern suburb or one of the suburbs of Kyiv, just to the north of Kyiv. I qualify the use of the word evidence because it clearly has a legal meaning, but there are further allegations of atrocities against civilians. There's both in terms of the numbers of dead, but also the means of their deaths and the weapons used that would have there'd be no need to use those weapons near a civilian population. So there are a number of investigations ongoing. The UN Human Rights Council is going to investigate. We need to allow these people time and space to make their own deductions so that any findings are sound. There should be no clamour for quick and easy answers, because that will not bring justice. But this, as we saw weeks ago, and we discussed weeks ago, this just does show, or seems to show, the brutality of some of the Russian units. Now, we've carried stories in the paper about how some Ukrainian civilians recounted to Russian troops what had happened to them by units that had previously moved through their villages and had met with compassion. So we're not saying this is every single Russian soldier all of the time. This seems to have been a complete breakdown in leadership in quite sizable numbers of units. But I don't want to suggest that it was every single Russian all of the time. But yes, there does seem to be some fairly grim evidence coming out from the area of Bucha.
Mutaz, would you like to come in on that?
It is just, it's horrific, and I'm afraid we're probably going to see and hear more of it as the Russians withdraw from more parts of Ukraine. and it needs to be investigated, of course. Thankfully, there's more sort of technology and effort and innovation going into collecting the evidence in Ukraine and archiving it than we've seen practically anywhere else in the world. So there will be some form of justice, and hopefully sooner rather than later.
Can we turn our attention to the south of Ukraine? Ukraine has accused Russia, this is on Sunday, of dropping phosphorus bombs on the Azovstal steelworks. What happened there? And Dom Nicholls, would you tell us a little bit about phosphorus bombs? How exactly do they work?
So phosphorus bombs are used for a number of different military applications. I mean, they create, they're full of very small little thermite capsules, if you like, very small sort of chunks, almost sort of sugar cube size chunks of thermite that burn at an intense heat, I mean thousands of degrees centigrade. So incendiary bombs, which are normally made of phosphorus, but there are other chemical compounds as well, these are designed to set things on fire, basically, or if they land on an electricity substation, for example, they'll do more than that. They'll probably, the whole thing will short-circuit and be destroyed. But they are essentially incendiary devices to create fires. Now, white phosphorus, which is another derivative, is used by Russia and the West. We use it as well for smoke. As soon as it's in contact with the air, it burns at an extremely hot temperature. I mean, again, thousands of degrees centigrade, but gives off huge plumes of very thick white smoke. And we use white phosphorus, as the Russians do, to create smoke screens. So you'll see on the front of tanks and many armoured vehicles these tiny little tubes, maybe about 10 inches long or so, 3 or 4 inches wide, pointing in a number of different directions. So they are the smoke dischargers. And what would happen is, certainly in our doctrine, if you're in an armoured vehicle and you come under attack, the first thing that happens is that the commander will press the buttons for the smoke dischargers, which will blast these things out, and they fly to about 10 metres or so in front of the vehicle and then explode, creating this enormous, thick plume of white smoke. At the same time, the driver will be selecting reverse and getting out there as fast as possible. So we use white phosphorus for camouflage and concealment, and in that regard it is perfectly legal to use. It is not legal to use white phosphorus or any such weapons in an anti-personnel role, and certainly not in civilian areas. Now the important thing about to differentiate between incendiary bombs and white phosphorus is that we were known, as I say, the Western forces were known that the first thing a vehicle would do, a tank would do, would be to hit the smoke dischargers and create this smoke screen. And Russia, or the Soviet Union, as was, always said that they had no first use policy of chemical weapons, but they counted white phosphorus as a chemical weapon. Now, we would never use white phosphorus in an anti-personnel role, but there was always we always suspected that they would use chemical weapons, claiming that we'd use them first in these for camouflage and concealment. So that's white phosphorus. Now, it doesn't look like these images that we see from the Azovstal plant in Mariupol, these images of devices exploding hundreds of feet above the steel plant and then raining down this shower of sparks. Basically, it's in daylight, so there'll be a completely different picture at night, but by daylight we see these sparks showering down. They then explode when they hit the ground in very, very small explosions, but they do create a big flash when they each land on the ground. So that's why we do not think that these are white phosphorus munitions that Russia has used at Azovstal, rather incendiary devices, which is another type of phosphorus. So in and of itself, we're not suggesting, we at the Telegraph are not suggesting this is a war crime. There were no troops out in the open. There were no Ukrainian troops. They're all undercover, as we've discussed for weeks now. So the use of these munitions, you could argue, well, what does it do? What's it going to do if no one's there? And actually, it's a busted up steel plant. So these things they didn't cause any fires. To be perfectly honest, there was a few flashes when they landed, but nothing. There was no great destruction. So you can argue, what was it for? But we are not suggesting that this was a war crime. It's still a pretty horrendous weapon. And as I say, there's absolutely no reason for it to be fired near civilians, and we know that there are civilians in the Azovstal plant, albeit underground. But we just need to be careful when you look at these very striking images, and very early on there are a number of people coming out saying white phosphorus, which I'm pretty certain it was not, but then taking the next step and saying, well, war crime, etc., etc. Now, I'm suggesting it was not a war crime, because I do not think it was white phosphorus, but we just need to be careful about what we are talking about and the implications thereof. But they are very striking images, which you can find on our website and pretty much all across other media as well.
So Russia, there were reports of pretty credible reports of white phosphorus being used in Syria, which Russia was involved in, which might help sort of explain why so many people are braced for this. You know, why people are so ready to accuse Russia of using white phosphorus. It was used, according to credible reports, in Syria. Phosphorus is in a sort of grey space legally. It's a bit problematic because it's not classed as a chemical weapon under the Chemical Weapons Convention. And so, you know, you can't really call it a chemical weapon. But if you look at the effect it has, it kills people indiscriminately, and it kills people through fire. It works rather similarly to chemical weapons, and yet it's in this legal sort of grey zone, which is why perhaps it's such a convenient tool to use if you are a nasty sort of large power conducting indiscriminate attacks. I'm not suggesting Russia has used it in Ukraine, but it has been used in countries where there's no regard for civilian casualties.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for the detail, and Mutaz for the context there. Dom, we started this podcast talking about Sweden and Finland announcing the intention to join NATO. Can you let's go in, Mutaz and Dom? Let's go into detail on that. I mean, I'd be quite interested to know what has Russia done, and also considering how many of their forces are now deployed in Ukraine, and looking towards Ukraine. What can they actually do?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there. What can they do? That was the reaction I got from Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, when we were in Finland a couple of weeks ago, talking about this. I mean, Russia has made very belligerent comments in response to the news from Finland, and they said it will not add to security in Europe. It's a mistake. There'll be repercussions, so on and so forth. I mean, we've heard this before. We've heard these threats before. Russia has struggled to get across a river in eastern Ukraine, so invading Finland is unlikely to be a realistic prospect in the near future. Of course, the problem all along here, as we've seen, the markedly different operational effort from Russia than we'd been expecting, is that it's got nuclear weapons. So what can it do? Not a lot. If it keeps talking in such a belligerent manner, that's not a good thing necessarily. Well, not a good thing at all, because Russia does have nuclear weapons and is very keen to keep talking about them and sort of rattling the nuclear saber. So no, Russia will not be able to do anything about the Finland and Sweden hopes for joining NATO. They will paint this as NATO encroachment, NATO expansion up to the borders. They will in no way entertain the idea that this is a sensible or a sovereign decision by those two countries in light of their own security concerns and the changing security architecture in Europe. So it will be. I expect some more bellicose language out of Russia in the next few days. Certainly, we should expect some more when Sweden make their announcement, expected imminently. So there should be some more fire-breathing rhetoric from Moscow on that front. But actually, what can they do? Short of diplomacy, and there's not an awful lot of that left between Russia and the West. Not a huge amount. We can talk. Just let Mutaz. I'm sure he's got a few views here, but I'll let Mutaz come in. Then there are wider implications of Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO, but I'll just pause there.
Yeah, this is a pretty savvy move by both countries. You know, if they'd made this move any time before the invasion of Ukraine, it was conceivable that Russia could take action to re-neutralize them, and that Russia could, militarily stop it. And so any time before the invasion of Ukraine, both sides, both NATO and Sweden and Finland, would have rejected such an idea because they wouldn't have wanted A, to be seen as provoking Russia, and B, they wouldn't have wanted to take such a risk, right? Russia has now, as Dom said, has now convened so many resources and so many troops in Ukraine, and those resources are in such a disastrous state that it's no longer conceivable that Russia can do really anything in terms of the battlefield, in terms of traditional warfare, to stop this from happening. The nuclear threats so far have been bluster, and frankly, if these countries are going to give in to the nuclear threats, then they've surrendered their sovereignty. There's no point after that. But there is Russia can still do something, and both Sweden and Finland are now gearing up for cyber attacks, for nasty sort of espionage. We know that Russia has been pretty brazen with its spies and conducting assassinations and so on in foreign countries, including on UK soil. So there'll be some of that. It's unfortunate that Sweden and Finland during the application process will not have NATO protections. So NATO countries, when a NATO country comes under serious cyber attack, you can actually trigger Article 5. There are protections in NATO to discourage Russia from conducting too serious a cyber attack, the kind of cyber attack that destabilizes a country. Sweden and Finland won't have those protections, so that's still quite risky. We've seen talk of Britain and perhaps America providing security guarantees, but I doubt that even those would cover the cyberspace. So that's something to watch out for. But the other thing I wanted to mention was that we talk about this as if this is NATO doing Sweden and Finland a favour. In some ways it is. Their security will be beefed up by joining NATO. But these two countries will be security contributors. They're not like Belgium. They are very skillful countries militarily. They're very good at using the resources they have. They can teach NATO, they can teach us, the UK, France, Germany, a hell of a lot about mobilization. You look at Finland and their ability to rapidly mobilize. They can teach us a hell of a lot about coastal defense. They use their intelligence very effectively. And so these countries are going to add to NATO's might as well as the other way around. And that's a very, very important thing to note. So this is good news in terms of sort of just pure logistics and, military cooperation. It's good news for the whole of Europe and even Canada and America.
Just a couple of other points, if I may, and Mutaz, I'd be really interested in your view here. Firstly, just the physical act of Sweden and Finland becoming the 31st, 32nd members of NATO. I think that's a good thing, and I think they are entirely sovereign. They've made their own decisions. They've not been in any way cajoled by the West. However, and I do think, as you've said, they will be a net contributors of defence to the alliance. But for the alliance, 30 members as are at the moment, for all the one member, one vote, which is lovely. Of course, if the US didn't want something to happen, it wouldn't happen. And all this diplomacy would have happened months and months and months ago. Possibly Ben Wallace's visit to the Pentagon last week was the final, just making sure US were happy with this, although I think that's probably a little bit too late. But the point is that I think the US would be very happy with this, not only because it's more members of the club, and as you say, Sweden and Finland have very capable militaries, and Finland's got they've been eyeball to eyeball with the bear for forever. So a lot to offer. But also, what it does do is this is going to allow America to take the foot off the gas is probably a bit too strong, but the more Europe steps up for its own regional security concerns, the more it allows the US to focus on what they see as the biggie out there. MI5 Director General gave his first speech, and he said that Russia is a storm in terms of international security. It's a storm, but China is the weather. So I think this is where we will see that come out to play. So the more Europe is able to step up and look after its own regional security concerns, the more the US will then be able to focus on China. I'll be interested in Mutaz's view of that. Just pause there.
Yep, that's completely right. And Washington is very interested, and has been sort of extremely interested ever since the end of the Obama era and through the Trump era, and now during the Biden era. It's been the one key continuation in terms of foreign policy. They're very eager to get Europe to step up, and to get NATO countries to pay more. And, expanding NATO in Europe will, of course, help that. America, we know it's a massive country. It has a huge military, but it believes that it only has the capabilities to fight on two fronts at the same time. It can only fight in two theatres. And so there is a risk that if, God forbid, World War III were to start, America's more likely to focus on what it sees as closer to home, which unfortunately isn't Europe, it's the Pacific region. It will focus on South America. It might have to focus on the Middle East or Africa, and Europe may have to fight on its own, or that's the doomsday scenario. So it's good for everyone in the West if Europe has the capabilities to look after itself. But Europe has to answer to the question. We saw over the weekend some tension between the traditional NATO powers and Turkey over Sweden and Finland joining, and that was just another example of Europe still hasn't got its act together in terms of its strategy, right? If Europe is going to be strategically autonomous, and if the continent is going to be able to sort of look after its own backyard, it needs Turkey, not least because you need that strategic advantage in the Black Sea to confront Russia. We've seen the effect Turkey's had in terms of closing the straits into the Black Sea, the Phosphorus Straits, the effect that has had on the Russian Navy. Turkey didn't have to do that. So you need Turkey, and it's still not sorted. And so what Finland and Sweden joining, if they do join, is going to do is it's going to force us to confront the question of Turkey. How do you deal with Turkey? Turkey's been half in, half out for the last few years. It has been a member of NATO, but it's purchased Russian missile defense systems. It's not too happy with Russia, not least because of the way Russia treats the Tatar population, which Erdogan considers himself to, have some responsibility over. But Turkey's not entirely confident with the West either. There's an opportunity now for the West to welcome Turkey in, to convince Turkey to become a full-on 100% NATO power. And it's going to be tricky, and it will take some compromise. And, many Kurdish political parties and Kurdish people might not be happy with that suggestion. And, some human rights activists might not be happy with it. But if Europe is serious about its strategic autonomy, it needs Turkey. So that's another question. Finland and Sweden is great, but there are big black holes still left to fill, to answer if Europe is going to actually defend its backyard. And I imagine that there are people in Washington, talking to London and Paris and Berlin about Turkey, this key question that now needs to be answered now that we have potentially Sweden and Finland in the fold too.
Yeah, and this goes back to Donald Rumsfeld. You may remember, 10, 15 years ago, Donald Rumsfeld was talking about this when the Baltic states and Poland joined NATO. Donald Rumsfeld was talking in fairly disparaging terms about France and Germany, and saying how the centre of gravity of NATO is shifting to the east with the Baltics and he was sort of picked up on that and said, well, hang on, what about the powerhouse, the economic powerhouse in Europe, Germany and France, huge militarily, P5 member, etc., etc. And Donald Rumsfeld said, oh yes, well that's the old Europe. He was talking about the new Europe, and then he started this debate about what's old Europe, what's new Europe. But I wonder if we're about to see that in NATO. If I mean, there have been questions to be answered about certainly Germany and to a lesser extent France's performance over the war in Ukraine so far. With if Sweden and Finland do join, you've got the Nordic bloc, you've got the Baltic bloc. I just wonder if we are seeing this Rumsfeldian move towards a new Europe. That also has to accommodate all the issues you've described there, Mutaz, about Turkey. But I wonder if France and Germany are in danger here of being a pace behind. I'm not saying they're backtracking at all, but a pace behind momentum in where European security is going. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
They are behind, and everyone sees it, but they don't really have an option, because through this NATO infrastructure, you've seen unity between the UK, which has just left the European Union, and Eastern European nations who are members of the European Union. Lots of unity between the UK and the Netherlands. You've seen the UK signing pacts with Sweden and Finland. This cross-European cooperation is occurring, and it's occurring around France and Germany, and they will soon find themselves in a position where, if they wish to lead Europe, which they do, and if they wish to maintain unity within the EU as well as NATO, they're going to have to go along with it. They won't have an option. And Macron can talk about his strategy for an EU army or EU defence or whatever, but the world is moving around them. And look how far, and that's thanks to NATO. Without that infrastructure, we wouldn't be seeing this. And look how far NATO has come since 2016. A few years ago, Macron was talking about NATO being brain dead, and he was right. It seemed that NATO had no purpose, apart from conducting military exercises every now and again. Russia, by invading Ukraine, has revitalized this organization. It's given it a purpose, perhaps for the next 50 years. It's united it more than ever, and it's allowed new members to join. There's some real excitement about what NATO can do now in terms of bringing Europe together and not provoking people, but making sure Europe can be safe going forward. So NATO's come a hell of a long way, and if France and Germany have aspirations to lead the continent again, which they do, they don't really have an option. And they've made a big mistake, actually, by being so behind and not joining the UK and America and the likes of Poland, even in being at the forefront of this new movement now in Europe for European defence.
Thank you, Mutaz, and thank you, Dom. Before we go to your final thoughts and just looking to the week ahead, I think we need to talk about another Ukrainian victory. This came on Saturday night. Dom and Mutaz, were you watching Eurovision?
I was, actually. After all the grief I got on Friday, I was watching. I mean, I said I didn't understand it because, I still don't understand why Australia is in Eurovision or Israel. So I don't understand that. I don't understand the public vote, but I do enjoy it, and I did watch it, and I was cheering for Moldova and Norway, the wolf and the banana. It's just genius, and obviously Spain for the lighting and the chord progressions.
I didn't watch it. I don't understand why we don't put up, top artists like Adele, the best talent we have. Why do
Sam
we put
Ryder
up...
came second, though. He came second. He did very well.
Yeah, but they're all sort of quiche, TikTokers. Anyway, I didn't watch it, but I was glad Ukraine won, and that it was quite political, but it was good. It's good to see.
There was a Ukraine UK 1-2 there, and I just thought it'd be interesting to note that the frontman of the Ukrainian act, Kalush Orchestra, has already gone back to Ukraine and joined in the defence of his country. do we have a sense of what did this win show us about Europe and about public opinion? I mean, I think it's obvious, but it's worth saying, especially for our foreign audience here.
Well, I think as Sam Ryder, the UK nominee, said, and we've got a story in today's paper. I mean, he said it's gone back to what Eurovision was supposed to be about, which is about unity and friendship and love and what have you. I mean, it has been nakedly. I mean, it is a nakedly political act, but then what isn't really these days? I've got no huge problem with that. I mean, there was very little rancour in the run up to it, and the widely held view that Ukraine was going to win the popular vote because of the war. So yeah, I think it speaks of a certain unity. I think you could read too much into it by saying France and Germany came last and UK and Ukraine came first and second. You could. There's too much you can read into this. I think you should just enjoy it for what it is. I mean, I can't work out if the hosts are supposed to be really bad, and that's good, or if it's just bad that they're really bad. I just don't understand it. But I will watch again next year.
Thanks, Mutaz, and thanks, Dom. And just a note from me, actually, if you're listening, that we spoke to the Ukrainian commentator for Eurovision last week, and the interview for that is in Friday's episode. So you can hear Timo Miroshnichenko, who was broadcasting from a bomb shelter. We interviewed him. It's the last episode in this podcast series. Do go and listen to that. He told us all about his life during the war and the experience of broadcasting and being a journalist in Ukraine at the moment. So yes, congratulations to Ukraine for taking the win. So Mutaz and Dom, can I have your final thoughts? What should we be looking for in the week to come?
Well, I think from the ground, for the last few days, I've been saying keep an eye on northeast and southwest. Northeast being around Kharkiv. I think there's a pause there now. I don't think Ukraine will be immediately able to go onto a large-scale offensive to try and cut into those supply lines. I think that will come. So maintain the focus on the southwest. That was Snake Island. Russia has to hold Snake Island if it wants to have any kind of meaningful impact on the southwest coast of Ukraine. And equally, if Ukraine holds Snake Island, then it just takes that option away from Russia. So keep your eye on the southwest. Also in the centre of the Donbass, around Severodonetsk. So this idea that originally this Russian push in the Donbass was going to be some massive encircling operation to go south from Kharkiv, north from Mariupol, and to cut off the those sort of 10 brigades, as we still think, 10 Ukrainian brigades in there. That now seems to be utterly hopeless. It looks like they might try and do a smaller encirclement around the town of Severodonetsk, but I mean they are having huge problems just in that small encirclement. But that is where their effort is. So I'd keep your eye on that, and also continue to look at Snake Island.
Thanks, Tom. Mutaz, would you like the final words?
Yes, I'd be watching, waiting for a formal sort of application from Finland, at least, to join NATO. It's an incredibly exciting moment. Maybe excitement's the wrong word, but it's a positive moment for Finland and for NATO. And it's a hopeful moment that in the face of this threat from an overbearing power, these two small countries are willing to sort of tell this big power doing wrong to go stuff itself, and to join a European defence system. And if that's too hopeful, I'd also keep an eye on the EU and where they go with the oil embargo on Russia, because those efforts look to have stalled thanks to Hungary, and so those are the two sides of how Europe is doing at the moment. On one hand, you've got enormous progress, and on the other, you've got increasing disunity and stalling, which isn't so great.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Freya Graham.